Of course, then there's, we've spoken about the development agenda and how women, it is important for women to be at the center of that. We've spoken about how we are as a country, from a skills development point of view, from a skills planning point of view, as well as a competitiveness point of view, how we are impacted by this fourth industrial revolution. And we understand also that there are other economies that are really, talking a faster language already, that we are talking about, as we were saying, that China has already started investing in 6G technology, and we're still talking about spectrum for 5 and 4G and 3G, right? But at the end of it all, there's got to be a conversation around partnerships and shared value, right? You're an ambassador for Code Week, and you also sit on the BRICS, BRICS Business Council.
Yeah, the Skills Working Group, yeah.
Skills Working Group.
Yeah, it's about skills there.
Right? And so how do we then reimagine this idea of shared value as well as partnerships in the context of then Femtali being the educator of choice in how we're capacitating the employee of the future, the business owner of the future?
So I think that first of all, we need to start having conversations around what is happening. Because I sit on the BRICS Business Council, I'm quite privy to certain realities that exist within the South African context, but that also relate to Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? So when we're looking at it from that perspective, what ends up happening is that you start realizing that actually government departments are not talking to each other, private sector is not talking to public sector, and initiatives that are being carried down from a civic perspective, from a civil perspective, civil organizations are not speaking to private sector, which are not speaking to public sector, and therefore you've got this disjointed, almost isolated mechanism of us getting to one direction, one particular goal. So everybody's working within different trajectories, and nobody's trying to actually communicate that, guys, did you know that this organization is actually running this? Yeah. Right? There are so many initiatives that are out there. Yes, mine is just one of a few. And yes, it is unique in the sense that I'm deliberately upskilling women when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution. And I'm intentional about that. Yeah. But there are other institutions that teach on coding. Yeah. There are other institutions that teach on various other aspects of technology. But they're not having a conversation with public sector, which is not having a conversation with private sector. So there will even be, and I was shocked with this, there are skills competitions, right, that even BRICS has, where we are able to send some of our people to go and compete in Russia, for example. In fact, one just happened recently. Government sometimes does not even know that these things are happening. Yeah. So now, if, let's say, TVET colleges are sending individuals to go and compete at that scale, do you not think that maybe these kids need some kind of support from government, right? But we're not having these conversations, and so there is no shared value, and there's no shared value because the value in itself is not being communicated, right? So what we need to do is actually say, okay, guys, we've got these projects. Right? We've got these organizations that are running these projects. Instead of us trying to wreck our brains about how to come up with our own innovation, and that maybe also is a critique on private sector stance, that you don't always have to be the ones that come up with the solutions. Yeah. There are civil organizations and NGOs and NPOs that have already come up with the solutions to it, right? So you can focus on the business. All you need to do is just plug into it. Yeah. You just literally need to take a project and plug into a project so that you can accelerate it. But oftentimes, we've got a hero syndrome in the private sector. We want to come up with a solution so that we look good on our BEE scorecards, so that government gives us more deals, right? Because, but then that's self-fulfillment. But if you would take the same objective and say, okay, actually, where are these organizations and what are they doing and how do you then plug into them? Instead of us reinventing the wheel, let's just take what it exists and let's just accelerate it. And that's how you create shared value. First of all, we need to understand that communication is key. Secondly, is that we need to stop with this hero syndrome of private sector and wanting to come up with solutions so that our BE scorecards will go. Yes, you will have a great BE scorecard, but it will be even more better, and you'll be able to empower other organizations that are doing it. I'm doing it. I love this brand. I love the Faith Mangope Technology Leadership Institute because I truly believe in it in every essence of the word. But now, instead of you, corporate, trying to then come up with your own and do it for the... Just plug in here and just say, okay, so then how then do we start taking this and capacitating it so that it serves a bigger cause than what we had imagined in the beginning?
I think, I mean, interestingly enough, so at the investment summit that we had last week,
That I saw you orchestrate. But anyways,
yes, while I was orchestrating the orchestra, Black Coffee says South Africa needs a family meeting, you know.
100%.
And in the family meeting, we ought to talk about our identity and who do we want to be to the world. And therefore, that will inform our initiatives that we then take on and our projects that we take on to eventually, I think, achieve that self, that sense of self. And so even with what you're talking around, removing some of the silos and trying to figure out a way in which this conversation becomes a one voice type of a conversation around how we all leverage each other when we're working in the same spaces to try to achieve a common goal. Because that often then will lead also to us being smarter around how we build incentives for the growth that we imagine. You know, Ghana, for example, 2009 said that they wanted to, they realized that the ocean's economy offered good value. It had high employment multipliers, so it was labor intensive, but also the tilapia, the fish, was high value fish, right? And therefore they could generate, a higher contribution to GDP. Over a 5-year period, they said no, they zero rated tax everything to do with that particular part of the ocean's economy. And within 5 years, output coming out of that sector had gone up by 6 times, right? And it's also then understanding that incentives don't need to be there forever. You can create incentives for a particular period until the sector gets into a particular level of global competitiveness. And then you can then bring it back to living normally like all the other sectors. And so I think, in terms of how you're putting around the conversation of shared value and the impediments to us not ever getting or not currently getting to a point where we are able to take advantage of the various things that are already in place, that we don't, build everything from scratch just so that I look like I'm a bit of a hero and I can punch my chest about it. But in understanding that there's a South African identity that I'm working towards. And that is a leadership vacuum problem.
Yeah, and it's a political will problem as well.
Yeah.
You see, we need to get to a point where we understand why we lead.
Yeah.
Right? And this speaks to the other aspect around leadership. It actually opens up a conversation around what is true leadership.
Yeah.
Right? What is true leadership? Is true leadership my ability to mobilize a couple of million people so that they can vote for me in a ballot paper so that I've got a job that is the number one citizen for the next, let's say, about 8 years or 9 years of my life, and so that I can retire and people will write books about me? Why do you lead? Why do you want to lead? Because let me tell you, when it comes to understanding the why part, you'll be able to set the agenda for that family meeting, because then you'll be able to establish your identity. Why do I want to lead in the first place? I'll tell you why I want to lead. I want to lead because I want to create a different reality from the one which we're experiencing now. I want to ensure that this country has got the same amount of capacity, brains, talent, offerings, outputs, even economic output as that of a different country that is deemed as a first world country, right? I want us to be able to be having examples that are referenced to us as they are to Denmark and Switzerland. Have you heard how many references? Even the education systems are an entire reference there. Even spanking children, it's an entire reference. Did you know that in Switzerland and in Sweden, this is what they don't do, right? But I want us to be able to sit on par. I'm so tired of maths and science results coming out, and we always have to justify the mediocrity with which we carry because we don't want to face facts. And the fact that we've got a lot of educators that are trained, a lot of educators that went to school for this thing. However, we've got a lot of people that are paying others and principals to get the job at the expense of those that are qualified. So we've got the system is sitting with about 5,000 or so teachers that are not equipped to even train our children. And then we wonder why maths and science results, amongst others, are doing so bad, because we've got shoddy teachers in the system. But if you knew that from a leadership perspective, you wouldn't demand reports at the end of the day. You should be able to go in there and say, why is it that, because what you're doing is committing fraud. If you say that you've got a qualification as being a teacher, and yet you You're not qualified for it. And yet you're teaching my child. Tell you what, you're committing fraud. I don't want you teaching my child.
Yeah.
And I will have civil society stand with me, because at the expense of this is an entire group of people who are relying on this one educator just to be qualified. And that's just looking at the education system as an isolation, right? So why do we lead? Do we lead so that we can be popular? Do we lead so that we can be famous? Do we lead so that we can loot? Do we lead so that the ATM called South Africa may be open to us, so that I'm able to be sustained for the rest of my life? Because if that's the reason why we're leading, then you're not a good leader. And in fact, my country does not need you to lead them. And another thing, we need to stop having, no offense to the investment conferences, but we really need to stop with this investment conferences thing. And I'll tell you why. The world is not stupid. South Africans are not stupid. A majority, we're not stupid. In the sense that we already know that, for example, in some of the investment conferences, the money that was pledged is already money that was going to be taken out anyways by those very same corporations, because it's their mandate to do that on an annual basis. Yeah. So it's not necessarily, it was not new investment that was attracted. It was the same investment that was attracted, operational expenditure. It was the same investments that were attracted over. And what we did was we got a whole bunch of media personalities and the whole media to verbalize the fact that we've just got investment. But the truth of the matter is, whether we had an investment conference or not, that investment would have happened because it's part of the
operational expenditure.
Okay, so now if we're going to be looking at that, then I have to go back and critique myself now as a leader and go, if nobody wants to put in money in my bank account called South Africa, what am I doing wrong? And how do I start looking at myself and introspecting? And this is not, I don't have the solution. I'm not a one-stop shop. But I'm telling you now, when we start having open conversations like that, it gives way for you and your platform to have conversations around it and have possible solutions to it. Because I bet you one thing, if they ask the Economist how to do it, the Economist has got a couple of ideas. Don't tell me that I'm wrong, because I know I'm wrong. The Economist has got the idea.
Absolutely. And so submissions we've already sent to National Treasury around how they can imagine the next iteration of the investment conference actually anchored around how the Africa Investment Summit was done. They came with a list of projects, investment projects before.
That's it.
And 56 of them were put on the table and said, guys, how can we fund these? And South Africa was targeting taking 25% of those, and 52 out of the 56 were funded at the end of that conference.
That's it.
That is not operational expenditure, that is new investment targeted towards certain sectors, etc. And absolutely love the critique, and certainly, creates an opportunity for us to extend the conversation around how we do things better. And I always say that policy making is not static, it's dynamic and it's iterative. And so we absolutely want these kind of conversations to come up and to surface so that we continue to be iterative in how we deal policy making, as well as how we do some of the things that are supposed to galvanize growth in a South African context and make us more competitive. So as we heard, guys, Sifuna, or did you know, to be centered more around South Africa, did you know South Africa is amazing at agriculture? Did you know South Africa is the #1 exporter of macadamia nuts? Did you know that South Africa is the #2 exporter of grapefruit? We want to continue having those conversations. Did you know that we've got Barack Obama's former BFF, Makabane, siyabulela man, do that thing that you do, nikangeli yellow bones, and you need to go like, go share, go subscribe. Nibizo Barack Obama, need to Barack Obama, Nanzi Awkward Economist, go like, go share, go subscribe. See you again next week.